Hi everyone, so this is part 3 of 3 for the respiratory system chapter, and in the last lecture video we looked at the volume changes in your thoracic cavity and the relationship between pressure, gas pressure to be particular, and lung volume or thoracic cavity volume. In that scenario, we did talk about the Boyle's law, which was the first of 3 laws that we are going to look at as far as the respiratory system is concerned. So the next law, so Boyle's law stated that the volume of a chamber and the pressure of its contents is inversely proportional. So for example, as the thoracic cavity expands, the pressure of gas inside it goes down, and gas moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And we looked at its implications as well. Now, here we're going to start off with the concept of partial pressure. As we all know that the air that we breathe in on planet Earth is a mixture of several gases. So oxygen gas, which is O2, is only one of many other gases that is found on Earth's atmosphere. The others being nitrogen, which is N2, carbon dioxide, water, helium, other inert gases, and many else. So the next law we're going to talk about relates to a concept called partial pressure. And this basically says that if you have a container with a mixture of gases, not just oxygen gas, but say we have nitrogen gas, which is N2, and oxygen gas, and carbon dioxide in here. This is a mixture of 3 gases. Dalton's law says that each gas is going to exert its individual pressure against the walls of the container. So the pressure of nitrogen gas alone out of this entire mixture of gases would be called a partial pressure. Similarly, oxygen would have its own partial pressure within the mixture of gases, as well as carbon dioxide. Now, the partial pressures of nitrogen gas plus oxygen gas plus carbon dioxide would be the total pressure of gases within this container. So essentially, what Dalton's law states is that in a mixture of gases, each individual gas is going to exert its own individual pressure, and that pressure is called partial pressure, and it is measured in millimeters of mercury. So the way this is written and represented is that out of the total gas pressure inside a container from a mixture, it is represented, partial pressure is represented with a P before the gas symbol. So for example, the partial pressure of nitrogen gas would be PN2. The partial pressure of oxygen gas is PO2, and partial pressure of carbon dioxide would be PCO2. And each gas with its own individual pressure gradient moves independently down from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure per Boyle's law. Now we all know that atmospheric pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. So if you are increasing in altitude from sea level, gas pressure decreases. Increase in altitude equals decrease in atmospheric pressure. Decrease in altitude equals increase in atmospheric pressure. Now here is a representation of that Dalton's law. So here you are at sea level. So at sea level, here are the individual, the total pressure of Earth's atmosphere. That includes the partial pressures of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water. So if you notice, nitrogen gas is actually more pressurized at 597 millimeters of mercury, followed by the second, which is partial pressure of oxygen, followed by carbon dioxide and water, which are very, very small compared to the other two. So as you go up in altitude, so now you are here, which is about 10,000 feet above sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen has gone down. So the partial pressure of oxygen has gone down significantly. So at sea level, it was 159 millimeters of mercury, and at 10,000 feet, it is about 110 millimeters of mercury. So the implication here is that as you increase in altitude, gas becomes less pressurized. So when gas becomes less pressurized, remember, per Boyle's law, gas moves from an area of high concentration or high pressure to an area of low pressure. So here, it is going to have a hard time, since the atmospheric pressure outside is so low at 10,000 feet above sea level, it's going to have a hard time to enter from outside the lung to inside the lung. The next law refers to partial pressures and gas solubility. So this law is referred to as Henry's law. Now, according to Henry's law, the higher the partial pressure, the higher the gas solubility. So partial pressure and gas solubility have a directly proportional relationship. So higher the partial pressure equals higher the solubility. Lower the partial pressure equals lower solubility. Now this law is Henry's law. So let's look at this diagram and go over the story that it is trying to tell us. And we're going to start off with the partial pressure of oxygen first and carbon dioxide. Now when you inhale oxygen, whose partial pressure is 159 millimeters of mercury, is entering through your nostrils, through your airway, through your trachea, and from the bronchial tree into each lung. Now here is what is happening inside each lung. Oxygen gas, so what you're looking at here is an alveolus. These cells are your alveolar type 1 or your simple squamous cells. This is the basement membrane for that, followed by the endothelium here that you're seeing. And this purplish red area is the inside of your blood vessel, your perialveolar capillary. So here you are looking at a red blood cell because oxygen gas is not going to dissolve directly into the fluid, which is the plasma of your blood, but instead it is going to enter your red blood cell or your erythrocyte, and it is going to hitch on to a large protein called hemoglobin. So on inhalation, oxygen, which is at 159 millimeters of mercury, goes through your nostrils, through your trachea, through your bronchi, gets into your alveolar sac. So from the alveolar sac, by the time it reaches the alveolar sac, it is at about 104 millimeters of mercury. So from here, it is going to diffuse through the walls of your alveoli, right here. It is not going to travel directly through blood plasma because oxygen has a very low solubility coefficient. So what this is that the gases that have a higher solubility coefficient can travel as gases in liquids. Gases with lower solubility coefficients have to be processed and have to be transported through transport molecules, which in this particular case, because oxygen has a lower solubility coefficient, oxygen is going to enter your red blood cell or your erythrocyte, and it is going to be transported via hemoglobin. So hemoglobin, so heme is red or iron, globin is a protein. So hemoglobin is a large protein that has 4 iron ions. So here's unit 1, 2, 3, and 4. So each hemoglobin molecule can transport 4 oxygen molecules. Now this is how oxygen enters your bloodstreams. We're right over here in the red, which is your perialveolar capillaries. So oxygen is going to enter your bloodstream here through your perialveolar capillaries. And it is going to go through this, which I'm shading on right now, which is your pulmonary vein. And it is going to get dumped right here in your left atrium. From the left atrium, which is the top chamber of the heart, it is going to move into the left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, it is going to go all over to your tissues. So from here, it is going to enter your aorta from the left ventricle, and it is going to go all through your systemic arteries. And here is a representation of your tissues that is undergoing cellular respiration. So at the tissue level, oxygen is going to get unloaded. It's going to hop off the ride, which by the time it reaches here, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 40 millimeters of mercury. Now here is where carbon dioxide is going to load on. So it's going to hitch on right here, travel through your systemic veins, and through your inferior and superior vena cava, it's going to get dumped in your right atrium. From the right atrium, it's going to go to your right ventricle, and from the right ventricle, it is going to exit the heart, go through your pulmonary arteries, and go right into your lung, which is where it is going to diffuse out. And we're going to look at molecularly how this happens. So basically, what Henry's law states is that at any given temperature, how soluble a gas is going to depend on its partial pressure and the solubility coefficient. So let's look at this diagram here. Here are 2 flasks with a certain amount of liquid. Now, solubility refers to the ability of a gas to dissolve or mix into this liquid, if you will. So what Henry's law states that the lower the gas pressure, the lower the solubility. The higher the gas pressure, the higher the solubility. So that tells you if a gas is pressurized, it is more soluble in your blood, versus if it's less pressurized, it is less soluble in your blood. So carbon dioxide, because it has a higher solubility coefficient, is about 24 times more soluble as oxygen. Nitrogen gas, although it is at higher pressure, it has a lower solubility coefficient. And because it has a lower solubility coefficient, it does not dissolve in blood, despite being in a higher volume and higher pressure in Earth's atmosphere. So essentially, gases that have low solubility coefficients have to be pressurized to a much larger extent than gases with a higher solubility coefficient. So we've talked about this overview right here, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Now this slide looks slightly overwhelming at first, but let's go over every step here, starting with what is happening. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order here. You guys can read this text later because it's going to be part of your PowerPoint reading that you do for the unit. But I'm going to start off here with the journey of oxygen. So what you're looking at is this is the alveolar sac, the alveolar cavity. You are looking at the wall of the alveoli right here, your simple squamous or the type 1 alveolar cells. This is the extracellular space right here, and this is the wall of your blood capillary, which is your endothelium, also lined with simple squamous cells. Now, oxygen first gets pushed through. So oxygen, when I say oxygen, I'm referring to oxygen gas, which is O2. So 2 atoms of oxygen. Now it diffuses into the blood because it has a solubility coefficient and is just pressurized right enough. So it's going to dissolve to your surfactant. It's going to get through the type 1 alveolar cells. It's going to push through this extracellular space. Going to go through the endothelial membrane here, and now it is in blood plasma. So this is where blood plasma is. This red large disc represents your red blood cell or your erythrocyte. Now, oxygen gas is going to enter your red blood cell, which is where oxygen gas combines with the hemoglobin molecule. So oxygen combined with hemoglobin is called oxyhemoglobin. Now, oxyhemoglobin is carried all over, and once it reaches the tissues, the oxygen dissociates from the hemoglobin. We're going to look at that a little bit later, and unloads and goes into the tissues that are going to use it for Krebs cycle. Now, all through your body, there is carbon dioxide being generated. So at this point of the alveoli, here's also what is happening. So in the alveolar sac, or the pulmonary gas exchange, oxygen is traveling from red blood cell out into the alveolus versus oxygen is traveling from alveolus to the red blood cell. So let's see what's happening here with the carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide diffused out of blood as carbon dioxide gas. Now, to see how that happened, you know this reaction because we visited this reaction very briefly in your digestive system, right? So in blood, the ions that are carried in blood that are part of blood's buffering system is the HCO3 minus ion, which is the bicarbonate ion, as well as the H plus ion, which is the hydrogen ion. Now, so HCO3 minus plus H plus in the presence of carbonic anhydrase produce carbonic acid. Now, carbonic acid can further chop up carbonic anhydrase can further chop up carbonic acid into carbon dioxide gas, which diffuses out of blood into the alveolus and you exhale out, and water, which is a major component of blood. Now, in the tissues, right, so we're going to repeat this diagram in lab. We're going to go over this in person fairly well. But in the tissues, the opposite process is happening. So here, this is your blood capillary. This is your tissues right here. Your tissues are producing carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide enters your blood vessels, goes into your red blood cell, where carbonic anhydrase and water from blood carbonic anhydrase is basically going to combine carbon dioxide and water and make carbonic acid, which is this. When carbonic acid is going to break down, it is not going to reverse back into these two components, but instead it is going to become a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. Now, this hydrogen ion combines with hemoglobin and can combine with oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. And this is what we just saw in the previous slide. That is how oxygen came into the tissues. Now we will talk about what this chloride shift is here for a minute. Now remember, when a carbonic acid breaks down into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion, this hydrogen ion is going to bind to your hemoglobin in the meantime while this oxygen is doing its thing, right? So this point number 6 here is a temporary point between what has bound to that hemoglobin or the HB at that particular time. So oxygen combined with hemoglobin is oxyhemoglobin. Oxygen leaving hemoglobin becomes deoxyhemoglobin. Carbon dioxide can also bind hemoglobin, and that is called carbaminohemoglobin. Now, as this hydrogen ion is basically engaged in forming bonds with this hemoglobin, this bicarbonate ion is pushed out of your red blood cell membrane and into this blood plasma right here. Now, this is where for the thing that goes out, which is bicarbonate, something has to come in. And the thing that comes in or is antiported with the bicarbonate ion is the chloride ion. So for every bicarbonate ion that gets pushed out of the red blood cell, a chloride ion enters the red blood cell. Now, this phenomenon is called the chloride shift. So essentially, here is what you need to know. So blood's capacity to transport oxygen depends on its solubility coefficient. Now, oxygen has a decent partial pressure, but has a very low solubility coefficient, which is why oxygen cannot dissolve and cannot be transported as gas in plasma. The bulk of oxygen has to be transported using a transport protein, which in this case is hemoglobin. About 98% of oxygen that goes to our tissues is carried via hemoglobin. Why does it not transport as oxygen gas? It is solely because the solubility coefficient of oxygen is very low. So in the alveoli, right, in the alveoli, when oxygen goes from the alveolus through the blood capillary wall and into your red blood cell and hitches the hemoglobin molecule, it is called oxyhemoglobin. So oxyhemoglobin is what is going to, it's bound with oxygens and is going to dump oxygens in your tissue. When you reach the tissues, that oxygen is going to dissociate from the hemoglobin, and hemoglobin without that oxygen is basically called deoxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin plus carbon dioxide, now hemoglobin plus carbon dioxide is called carbaminohemoglobin. So carbaminohemoglobin. Now, although carbon dioxide is coming out of the tissues with less pressure, it has a higher solubility coefficient, which is why carbon dioxide can travel as carbon dioxide gas in your blood. Now, hemoglobin is basically a protein that is synthesized by immature red blood cells. Now, red blood cells, if you recall in your bones unit, all blood cells are synthesized in the bone marrow. So, and there's 4 types of hemoglobin. So we have embryonic, we have fetal hemoglobin, adult hemoglobin, and then there's individuals that have a mutation that results in their red blood cell becoming sickle-shaped as opposed to a biconcave, flexible, round shape. So essentially, embryonic and fetal hemoglobin have a higher concentration of hemoglobin itself, and therefore a greater affinity for oxygen gas. Remember, one hemoglobin molecule can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. Hemoglobin and red blood cell are not interchangeable terms. Each red blood cell has millions and millions of hemoglobin molecules. Out of all those hemoglobin molecules, each hemoglobin can further hitch up to 4 oxygen molecules. Now, carbon dioxide gas, part of it, about 7% of it gets dissolved in plasma itself, which is due to that slightly higher solubility coefficient. Part of it is transported via hemoglobin, which is through your carb-aminohemoglobin, and the bulk of it travels as your bicarbonate and hydrogen ion that we just saw. So essentially, from the H2CO3, which is your carbonic acid, carbonic anhydrase is going to chop it up as HCO3 minus as well as H plus. Now the H plus is going to become engaged with that hemoglobin molecule, whereas the bicarbonate is going to exit out of the red blood cell, and this is how most of the carbon dioxide goes or is transported. This is how. And for every bicarbonate ion that is pushed out of the red blood cell, a chloride ion is uptaken by the red blood cell, which is what your chloride shift is. So bicarbonate diffuses out of the red blood cell and into plasma. Chloride diffuses from the plasma and into the red blood cell or your erythrocyte. This whole process is reversed when this gets to the lung. So essentially, here's what you need to repeat. One is that in the alveolus, oxygen gas enters your bloodstream, attaches to the hemoglobin, becomes oxyhemoglobin, travels to the heart, and then travels to the tissues. In the tissues is where oxygen is kicked into the tissues, which is where it's used for Krebs cycle. Carbon dioxide is loaded up onto blood, and part of it travels as carbaminohemoglobin, part of it gets dissolved into plasma and travels that way, and the bulk of it first becomes carbonic acid, then becomes hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion, and it travels back up to the heart and from the heart into the lungs as that bicarbonate ion, which is where the carbonic anhydrase is first going to shift the bicarbonate ion and the hydrogen ion to make carbonic acid, and in the lung it is going to break down H2CO3. So this was in the tissues. In the lung, when H2CO3 is broken down, it is going to become CO2 and H2O. This is exhaled out, as is a little bit of this. So this is where I'm going to stop with the lung physiology, and I want to devote some time in class to revisit so we understand all of the different laws and how those laws are playing in to this process of respiration.